Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm Steve Lance. President Biden is in Florida today surveying damage by Hurricane Ian. He also meets with his political rival, Florida Governor Ron Desantis. NTD's Iris Tao brings us more.
Surveying storm damage by helicopter and meeting with local residents. President Biden is in Florida on Wednesday, vowing to help it rebuild.
Today, we have one job, and only one job, and that's to make sure the people of Florida get everything that they need to thoroughly recover.
The trip is marked by a political ceasefire between Biden and Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, a top Biden critic who's also a potential White House contender. At a joint press conference, Biden stressed unity.
This is the United States of America, and I emphasize united.
And DeSantis thanks Biden for prompt federal action on Hurricane Ian.
We were very fortunate to have good coordination with the White House. The next day, we got a major disaster declaration approved by the president, and we really appreciated that.
But Biden's praise for DeSantis takes a different turn as he brings up climate change.
And I think the one thing this has finally ended is a discussion about whether or not there's climate change. First of all, the biggest thing the governor's done and some of the others have done, they've recognized this thing called global warming.
DeSantis did not address the issue during Wednesday's press conference, but has in the past slammed what he calls a left-wing agenda behind climate issues.
What I've found is people, when they start talking about things like global warming, they typically use that as a pretext to do a bunch of left-wing things that they would want to do anyways. And so we're not doing any left-wing stuff.
And Biden and DeSantis have had a number of political battles in just the past months, including over the Biden administration's border policies and over the Florida governor's decision to send illegal immigrants over to Martha's Vineyard. And just a day before the Wednesday trip, the White House press secretary has just reiterated Biden's criticism of DeSantis' move. Let's take a look.
The president laid out his concerns and outrage by the stunt, the political stunt.
But she also said the political fight between the two will stop for the moment.
There will be plenty of time to discuss differences between the president and the governor, but now is not the time.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
OPEC is cutting oil production, and it's the biggest cut since 2020. The White House responded today, calling it short-sighted and using it as an opportunity to push for a quicker transition to renewable energy. NTD's Melina Wisecup has more details on this. So, Melina, what can you tell us about OPEC's decision and what kind of impact this might have?
Yeah, so right now the national average cost of gas is around $3.80 per gallon, but in some parts of the country, people are paying even more than that. For example, we're here in D.C., where, as you can see, the price is closer to $5 a gallon, and the same is true over on the West Coast. People in California, for example, are paying anywhere from $5 to $6 on average per gallon. And unfortunately, these prices are expected to rise once again. Though experts are saying they do expect an incremental increase in prices, they're not expecting them to spike they're not expecting a major spike in these gas prices, but we do expect to see a gradual price increase. Now, this is after OPEC agreed to scale back their production. The market has already responded to this. We've seen the global price of oil go up slightly today. And so in that meeting earlier, major oil producers, including Saudi Arabia and Russia, agreed to scale back their production by 2 million barrels per day. And OPEC says this is what's needed to provide stability for the oil market.
They're concerned about the lack of investment in the industry, which is also being echoed by a lot of companies in the West. The reality of this situation is if you want to attract investment, you need higher oil prices.
OPEC has already been underperforming their actual quotas, so the cut in production will actually be closer to around 1.25 million barrels per day. And this decision ignores Biden's calls for foreign suppliers to sustain and increase production. In response, the White House said they were disappointed and called the action short-sighted. So how much will it affect the price you pay? Experts say it all depends on how the U.S. responds.
We're going to stay in this range for a while. The United States continues to release oil from the strategic reserve. I mean, that, in my view, is dangerous. We're at our lowest levels since 1984.
In addition to continuing to use oil from our emergency stockpile, the U.S. is also considering an export ban to Europe. But this may also have negative effects down the road.
It disrupts fuel flows in such that eventually refiners are going to be forced to cut runs significantly in the United States. That's eventually going to lead to even higher prices in the U.S. So both of these options now that they're discussing are very short term. What they should be doing is encouraging domestic production.
Now, President Biden is also directing the Energy Department to explore ways to increase domestic production in the immediate term, while also calling for a quicker transition to renewable energy. The president also is calling on U.S. energy companies to keep their prices down. But as we know, while the president can ask for energy companies to keep prices down, how they respond is ultimately up to them, since those companies are independent. Steve, back to you.
I recently had a chance to speak with Representative Mariannette Miller Meeks from Iowa. We discussed gas prices and energy independence. Here's part of our exchange.
Congresswoman Mary Miller Meeks, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Congresswoman, right now there's an energy crisis in Europe. We're hearing rumblings of that potentially happening in the United States going into the wintertime. Do you think this could be avoided?
Well, absolutely, it could have been avoided, and this started with policies from President Biden the day he was inaugurated, when he canceled the Keystone Pipeline, hasn't had auctions for leases on federal land, and hasn't allowed permitting even when there is an energy company that has an auction. You all are very used to energy production in southwestern Pennsylvania, where we are, and in Iowa we have a huge renewable energy portfolio. 50% of our energy is from renewables, and we export energy as well.
How, speaking of Iowa specifically, how is the energy, shortage or, high gas prices affecting the farmers in your state?
Well, people often don't connect high food prices with the lack of, gasoline production or oil and gas, but they're absolutely related. So the diesel that goes into tractors in order to both plant and plow and harvest. Natural gas is used for fertilizer production. Petrochemicals are used in the development of, pesticides and fungicides, our petrochemical industry. So there's a huge connection between oil and gas production and food prices. So just as gasoline prices are high, diesel prices are high, that relates to food prices. And then how do we transport food? We transport in trucks or rail cars or by barges on the Mississippi River. All of those costs have increased, which leads to increased food prices for you, the individual, when you go to the grocery store.
Another issue I'd like to ask you about how it's affecting Iowans. You typically wouldn't think that it does, but the issue of the southern border. How is that affecting a state that's not anywhere close to the southern border?
Well, I'm from Texas originally, interestingly enough, and so have had, encounters with illegal immigration. But what we're seeing at our border now is just unbelievable. There is an absolute crisis at the southern border. I made my first trip to the southern border last year as a member of Congress, and said at that time, people may wonder why somebody from Iowa is at the southern border. Interstate 35 runs the entire width of our country, and with Interstate 35 becomes drugs, illegal drugs, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and when you talk about humanity, more people have died crossing the southern border under this administration than under previous administrations. So it's an inhumane crisis not to control our southern border. We're enriching the cartels, but yes, they bring drugs, they bring human trafficking and sex trafficking, all of which is a burden to communities. We welcome immigrants. We want legal immigration. We want a controlled access to the southern border, but we need to stop the flow of drugs. We need to stop people coming across the border on the terror watch list, and we need to control our southern border.
Congresswoman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The U.S. national debt has surpassed $31 trillion for the first time ever. It's been on a steep rise since the pandemic started.
The Treasury Department published data on Tuesday saying the U.S. national debt has surpassed $31 trillion for the first time in history. President Biden and Congress increased government borrowing during the COVID-19 pandemic in order to prop up the economy amid job losses and supply chain disruptions. Prior to the pandemic, at the end of 2019, the national debt stood at under $23 trillion. Just a year later, when former President Trump was still in office, it had risen to almost $28 trillion and has continued to add gains since. However, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget said in a Monday statement that the U.S. has now overcome the most severe challenges of the pandemic, but that the Biden administration continues to borrow huge amounts of money. As the committee put it, just in 2022, Congress and the President have approved a combined $1.9 trillion in new borrowing, and President Biden has approved $4.9 trillion in new deficits since taking office. We are addicted to debt. They say what's even more troubling than the debt itself is where it's heading, warning that excessive borrowing could see inflation skyrocket further and increase the national debt to a new record by 2030. They say government should commit to no further borrowing at least for the remaining 3 months of this year. In September, Biden pointed out how he reduced the budget deficit.
We're actually reducing the federal deficit. You know, they talk about responsible debt. The last guy left me with a giant deficit. Well, guess what? In my first year, I reduced the deficit by $350 billion.
We reached out to the White House for comment on the national debt and government borrowing, but didn't hear back before broadcast.
The number of murders last year in the United States rose. This is according to a new report by the FBI this week. The agency's report said that murders rose by 4.3% in 2021 to almost 23,000 people killed. That increase is in addition to the almost 30% rise in 2020. Justice Department officials said that the latest data for 2021 includes some estimates for incomplete data. Several key metropolitan areas, including New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, are transitioning to a new data collection system. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.